A Mongol army catapults dead bodies over a city's walls. It was one of the first recorded acts of biological warfare in human history. 12 ships docked in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors aboard were dead or dying. Their skin was covered in black, swollen lumps oozing blood and pus, and they were burning with fever. Port officials ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately, but it was already too late. Within 5 years, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population was dead. In some cities, the death rate reached as high as 80%. A peasant who was legally bound to his lord in 1345 could walk away and demand wages in 1355 because there was a shortage of laborers. The Renaissance, the rise of the middle class, the birth of modern medicine, the questioning of the church that eventually led to the Reformation, all of it traces back, at least in part, to one disease that arrived on 12 ships in Sicily in the autumn of 1347. So how did the worst catastrophe in European history accidentally help build the modern world? To understand that, you first have to understand how Europe functioned in the Middle Ages. Here is Europe in the early 1340s. At the very top of society sit the nobility and the clergy. They own most of the land, they dominate the courts. Below them, making up the overwhelming majority of the population, are the peasants. They work land they will never own and pay taxes and dues they can never escape. Moving from one village to another often requires permission. Leaving your lord's land without permission can be a crime. The system that governs their lives is called feudalism, and it is not something that can simply be voted away. Above all of it sits the church. The church runs the hospitals, the schools, and much else besides. The church provides the explanation for everything that happens in the natural world. When crops fail, it is God's will. When people die, it is God's will. This is the world into which the plague arrives. 1346. Present-day Crimea. A Mongol Khan named Jani Beg has the Genoese trading port of Kaffa under siege, but his own army is dying of something nobody in his camp has ever seen before. So instead of retreating, he does something almost nobody sees coming. He loads his trebuchets with infected corpses and flings them straight over the city walls. The Genoese merchants trapped inside flee anyway, but fleeing doesn't save them, it just carries the disease with them. By October 1347, 12 ships from the Black Sea dock at the port of Messina in Sicily, and the people waiting on the docks get a horrifying surprise. Most of the sailors on board are already dead. The ones still alive are covered head to toe in black, oozing buboes. Sicilian authorities panic and order the ships straight back out to sea, but it's already too late. The rats, the fleas, and the disease itself are already ashore. It moves through Sicily within weeks. It crosses to mainland Italy before the year is out, and in the early months of 1348 it arrives in Florence. Florence in 1348 is one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated cities in Europe. It has banks, magnificent churches, and a population of perhaps 90,000 people. A writer named Giovanni Boccaccio is living in Florence when the plague arrives. He watches what happens and writes about it with a clarity and honesty that make his account one of the most extraordinary documents of the entire medieval period. He describes the symptoms, the buboes, the dark patches on the skin caused by bleeding beneath the surface, the fever. He describes how fast people die. A person who goes to bed feeling well wakes up dying and is dead before the day is out. He describes what the dying does to the living. Priests refuse to give last rites. Doctors refuse to treat patients. Neighbors refuse to help neighbors. Parents abandon children. Children abandon parents. He describes bodies piling up in the streets because there are not enough healthy people left to carry them to the churchyards. He describes people loading the bodies onto carts like cargo and dumping them into mass graves. Florence loses somewhere between half and two-thirds of its population in a single year. The plague does not stop at Florence. It moves north and west with a speed and indifference that no human institution can slow. By 1349, it is in England and Germany. By 1350, it has reached Scandinavia. The cold does not stop it. The mountains do not stop it. Prayer does not stop it. The proclamations of kings and bishops do not stop it. Nothing stops it. And the dying is not clean. It is not quiet. It is not the dignified death of a person in a bed surrounded by loved ones. It is grotesque and random and utterly indifferent to who you are. The plague does not distinguish between a bishop and a beggar. A cardinal is just as likely to die as a farmhand. And this, in its own way, is almost as destabilizing as the death toll itself. Because for 500 years the Church has taught that a person's position in life is divinely ordained. God put the nobility above the peasants. God put the clergy above everyone. The theological system that has explained the world to Europeans for half a millennium has no satisfying answer to this question. And for the first time, on a massive scale, ordinary people begin to notice. By 1353, the worst is over. Europe falls silent. It is a silence of absence. Fields that had been farmed continuously for generations are empty. Villages that had 200 people have 20. Cities that had been loud and crowded and alive are hollowed out. The roads that had carried merchants, pilgrims, and armies for centuries carry almost nobody. Somewhere between 25 and 50 million people are dead in Europe alone. In total, across Europe and Asia, the death toll is somewhere between 75 and 200 million. And then something happens that nobody planned. The survivors discover they have power. There are not enough people left to work the land. The landlords, who have had enormous authority over the peasantry for centuries, suddenly find themselves with empty fields and nobody to till them. A lord who loses half his workers cannot simply replace them. There are no replacement workers. Everyone is short of labor. So for the first time in centuries, the people at the bottom of the feudal system have something they have never had before: leverage. Now a peasant can walk away from one lord and go to another who offers better terms. Landowners who would have had a runaway peasant flogged or imprisoned 10 years earlier are now forced to compete for workers. They offer wages, they offer reduced obligations, they offer better land. They have no choice. And the peasants, slowly, cautiously, not quite believing what is happening, begin to understand that the world has changed. But the old order does not simply collapse. The landlords and the nobility fight back. The Statute of Labourers, passed in England in 1351, tries to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force laborers to work for the same rates they had before. It proves largely impossible to enforce. There are not enough officials to enforce it, and not enough laborers willing to accept it. The Peasants' Revolt breaks out in England in 1381, led by a man named Wat Tyler, demanding an end to serfdom and a reduction in taxes. The Jacquerie rises in France a generation earlier for similar reasons. Both are brutally crushed. Their leaders are executed. The immediate revolts fail, but the underlying shift in power cannot be crushed. The church takes a different kind of blow. Its authority is not destroyed by the plague, but it is damaged in a way that will take centuries to fully reveal itself. For centuries, the church has been the unquestioned intellectual authority in European life, and it has just spent 5 years watching its prayers fail, its hospitals overwhelmed, its clergy dying, its theological explanations for why the plague is happening grow more and more strained as the death toll rises. For the first time, ordinary Europeans begin to wonder whether the church has all the answers it claims to have, whether the system it supports, the feudal order it endorses as divinely ordained, is really beyond question. Artists begin to change what they paint. Medieval art is flat and stylized and spiritual. In the generation after the plague, something changes. Artists in Italy, the region hit earliest and hardest, begin trying to paint people as they actually are, as bodies, as individuals, as mortals. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence and wrote about what he saw, writes in the Italian vernacular rather than Latin. He writes for ordinary people, not just for the clergy. The idea that knowledge and beauty and art belong to everyone, not just the educated elite, is one of the foundational ideas of the Renaissance. Medicine changes too. It changes slowly and often wrongly at first, but the desperation to understand what has just happened drives a new kind of thinking. Physicians who had relied on Galenic theory, on the idea that disease came from imbalances of the four humors, look at the Black Death and realize that the theory has little useful to say about it. Observation begins to challenge authority. The question is no longer just, what does Galen say, but what do we actually see happening? This marks the beginning of a more empirical approach to medicine in Europe. It will take another 300 years to produce anything resembling modern science, but the plague is where the door begins to open. In 1377, the Adriatic port city of Ragusa develops the first systematic quarantine in history. Ships arriving in the harbor must anchor offshore for 30 days and allow no one to disembark while the city waits to see if anyone aboard develops symptoms. The 30-day period is later extended to 40 days. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta. The word quarantine comes directly from the Black Death. The world that emerges from the plague is not the world that went into it. It is more equal, more questioning, more willing to challenge authority, more interested in the individual human body and the individual human experience as subjects worthy of serious attention. None of this happens cleanly or quickly or without enormous resistance from the people who benefited from the old system. But the direction of travel has changed. The feudal system that had kept much of Europe in effective servitude for centuries is beginning, slowly and painfully, to loosen its grip. In the years after the plague, the idea of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work begins to take hold. In 1345, it was a revolutionary idea. By 1355, it was a demand that many landowners had no choice but to meet. The modern world's most basic assumptions about the relationship between a worker and an employer were not born from an enlightened philosopher, or a great political movement, or a careful reform of the law. They were born from a catastrophe so enormous and so random that it shattered a system that had endured for centuries and left the people who survived it no choice but to build something new from the wreckage. A flea bit a rat boarded a ship docked in Sicily, and the world was never the same again.